I'll never forget the day of my wedding to Andrew the Roar. Elizabeth felt like the luckiest woman in the world as I walked down the aisle of the small-town church, my white dress flowing gently with each step. Andrew's eyes, full of love and promises, welcomed me at the altar. At that moment, I believed our love would last forever. Our honeymoon was brief but unforgettable. We spent a week on the coast, enjoying the sea, sun, and each other's company. However, reality awaited us upon our return. Andrew had inherited the responsibility of the family farm after his mother's death, and it was time for us to settle there. The day we arrived at the farm, I felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. The property was beautiful, with vast green fields and an old but charming two-story farmhouse. Robert greeted us at the entrance with a warm smile and a strong hug for both of us. "Welcome home," he said, and those words resonated within me. Could I really call this place so different from the bustling city where I grew up? Home? The first few days were a whirlwind of activity. Andrew immediately immersed himself in farm work, rising before dawn and returning exhausted at nightfall. I, for my part, tried to adapt to my new role as a rural housewife. The domestic chores were overwhelming at first, but I was determined to do my best for Andrew's sake. Robert was a constant presence during those early days. Always willing to help, he taught me the ins and outs of the house and told me stories about Andrew's family. His kindness and patience made me feel more comfortable in my new environment. As the weeks passed, I began to establish a routine. I would get up early to prepare breakfast for Andrew and Robert, then take care of household chores, and in the afternoons, I would often sit on the porch reading or contemplating the landscape. It was during those moments of tranquility when I began to realize how lonely I felt. Andrew, though loving, was always busy with farm work. Our moments together were limited to dinners and brief conversations before bed. Gradually, I felt we were growing apart, and a feeling of emptiness began to grow inside me. It was then that Robert began to fill that void. At first, they were just casual conversations during breakfast or while I was hanging laundry. But over time, these moments became more frequent and deeper. Robert had a way of listening that made me feel truly understood. He told me about his late wife, about the challenges of raising Andrew alone, and about his dreams and fears. One day, while Andrew was in town buying supplies, Robert invited me for a walk around the property. We walked together, admiring the golden wheat fields swaying in the breeze. At one point, Robert stopped and looked at me with an intensity that made me shiver. "Elizabeth," he said softly, "you don't know how glad I am that you're here. You've brought light to this old farm." I felt a blush rise to my cheeks, and my heart began to beat faster. At that moment, I realized that my feelings for Robert had changed. I no longer saw him just as my kind father-in-law, but as an attractive and understanding man who made me feel alive in a way I hadn't experienced in a long time. That night, as I lay next to Andrew in bed, my mind kept reliving that moment with Robert. Guilt was eating me up, but I couldn't deny the excitement I felt. How could I be developing feelings for my husband's father? I promised myself I wouldn't act on those feelings, that it was just a passing phase due to my loneliness. But fate had other plans. As the days went by, Robert and I grew closer and closer. Our conversations became more intimate, our glances more prolonged. I tried to convince myself that I wasn't doing anything wrong, that we were just good friends. However, deep in my heart, I knew I was treading on dangerous ground. The turning point came on a rainy autumn afternoon. Andrew had gone to the neighboring town to attend an agricultural fair and wouldn't return until the next day. Robert and I were alone in the house, sitting in front of the fireplace, listening to the crackling of the fire and the patter of rain against the windows. I don't know who made the first move, him or me. Suddenly, our lips met in a passionate and desperate kiss. All the repressed feelings, all the tension accumulated for months, exploded at that moment. We gave ourselves to each other with a passion I had never experienced before. Afterwards, lying on the couch, the reality of what we had done hit us hard. Remorse and guilt took over me, but at the same time, I couldn't deny how alive I felt. "This can't happen again," I said with a trembling voice. Robert nodded, but his eyes said, otherwise we both knew that, despite our words, this was only the beginning. The following days were torture. Every time I looked at Andrew, I felt as if I had a traitor sign stuck to my forehead. I tried to make up for it by being more attentive and affectionate, but guilt was consuming me from within. However, despite my good intentions, I couldn't resist the attraction I felt towards Robert. We met in secret, stealing moments of passion when Andrew was busy in the fields. Each encounter was a mixture of ecstasy and remorse, an intoxicating cocktail from which I couldn't escape. Our affair continued for months. We became experts in the art of deception, finding excuses to spend time together, exchanging knowing glances during family meals. It was a dangerous game, and deep down we knew it couldn't last forever. Fate, however, had other plans. One afternoon, while Robert and I were passionately kissing in the barn, we heard a noise. We separated abruptly, terrified, only to see Mike, one of the farmhands, staring at us, wide-eyed. The world stopped at that instant. Mike, visibly uncomfortable, mumbled an apology and ran out. Robert and I looked at each other, knowing that our secret had been discovered. "I have to talk to him," Robert said gravely. "I have to make sure he won't say anything." I nodded, unable to speak. Fear paralyzed me. What if Mike told Andrew? How could we explain this? The following days were agony. Every time I saw Mike, I felt my heart stop. The young man avoided my gaze and seemed uncomfortable in my presence. Robert assured me that he had spoken to him and that he had promised to keep quiet, but the uncertainty was killing me. It was then that Robert made a decision that would change our lives forever. One night, while the three of us were having dinner together, Robert cleared his throat and said, "Andrew, son, there's something I need to tell you." My heart stopped. Was he really going to confess everything? I looked at Robert in panic, but his expression was one of determination. "What is it, Dad?" Andrew asked. Unaware of the emotional tornado that was about to be unleashed, Robert took a breath and began to speak. He told Andrew everything. How we had started to get closer, how feelings had grown between us, and finally, how we had betrayed his trust. I watched as Andrew's face went from confusion to shock and finally to a mixture of pain and fury that I had never seen before. He jumped up from the table, knocking his chair to the floor. "How could you do this to me?" he shouted, tears in his eyes. "My own wife and my father." I tried to speak, to explain myself, but the words got stuck in my throat. What could I say to justify what we had done? Andrew looked at both of us with a mixture of disgust and pain. Then, without saying another word, he left the house, slamming the door. The silence that followed was deafening. Robert and I sat at the table, unable to look each other in the eye. Our affair, which had once seemed exciting and thrilling, now revealed itself in all its crudeness. An unforgivable betrayal that had destroyed the person we both loved. The following days were hell. Andrew refused to talk to either of us. He stayed in the barn, sleeping on an old cot, and only entered the house when he knew we wouldn't be there. The pain in his eyes every time we crossed paths was unbearable. Finally, a week after the confession, Andrew packed his things and left. He didn't say where he was going, only left a note saying he needed time and space and that he would contact us through his lawyer for the divorce proceedings. His departure was like a cold bucket of water that woke me up from the fantasy I had been living in. Suddenly, the reality of what I had done hit me with full force. I had destroyed my marriage, betrayed the trust of a good man, and for what? For moments of passion that now seemed empty and meaningless. The news of our infidelity spread quickly through the town. Suddenly, I became the center of all gossip and disapproving looks. the same people who had welcomed me with open arms when I arrived, as Andrew's new wife now looked at me with contempt and whispered behind my back, Robert wasn't doing well either. His reputation, built over decades of honest work and dedication to the community, was shattered overnight. Many of his old friends turned their backs on him, and the farm business began to suffer when people in town decided to boycott his products. Our relationship, which had once been passionate and exciting, became tense and uncomfortable. We could no longer look each other in the eye without feeling the weight of guilt and remorse. The moments of intimacy we had shared now seemed distant and surreal, as if they had been part of another life. We tried to move forward, trying to keep the farm running and to cope with social ostracism. But each day was a struggle. Andrew's absence was felt in every corner of the house, in every moment of the day. His empty chair at the dining table, his work boots, still on the porch, everything constantly reminded me of the damage we had caused. One night, as I sat on the porch looking at the stars, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living like this. Trapped in an endless cycle of guilt and regret, I needed a new beginning, away from the memories and constant judgment. The next morning, I communicated my decision to Robert. Although I saw the pain in his eyes, I also noticed a flash of understanding. We both knew this was for the best. I packed my things in silence, taking with me only the essentials. Before leaving, I left a letter for Andrew, asking for forgiveness once again and wishing him to find the happiness he deserved. I didn't expect his forgiveness, but I needed him to know how much I regretted my actions. With a heavy but determined heart, I got into my car and drove away from the farm, leaving behind the scene of my greatest happiness and my worst mistake. The following months were a whirlwind. I traveled aimlessly, taking temporary jobs in different cities, waitress at a small roadside cafe, receptionist at a motel. I even tried my luck as a door-to-door saleswoman. Each new place, each new job, was an attempt to escape my past, to reinvent myself. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't run away from my memories or my guilt. The nights were especially difficult. In the stillness of cheap hotel rooms or rented apartments, the memories assaulted me. Andrew's hurt face, the look of disappointment in Robert's eyes, the whispers and judgmental looks of the townspeople. It all came back to me in waves, robbing me of sleep and peace. It was during one of those moments of nocturnal introspection when I realized that running away wasn't the solution I needed to face my past, accept my mistakes, and try to rebuild my life on more solid foundations. With this new determination, I decided to return to my hometown. It wouldn't be easy. I knew that I would have to face the questions and judgments of those who knew me, but I felt it was the only path to redemption. The day I arrived in my old city, I felt a mixture of nostalgia and anxiety. The familiar streets, the parks where I used to play as a child, everything seemed the same and yet different. Or maybe it was me who had changed. I rented a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. It was modest, but clean and cozy. For the first time in months, I felt I had a place I could call home. Finding work wasn't easy. My story preceded me, and many employers closed their doors as soon as they knew who I was. But finally, the owner of a small bookstore gave me a chance. "We all make mistakes," she told me with an understanding smile. "What's important is how we choose to move forward." Those words were a balm for my wounded soul. At last, someone saw me as a person, not as the sum of my mistakes. Working in the bookstore turned out to be therapeutic. I immersed myself in books during my free time, finding comfort and wisdom in their pages. Little by little, I built a new routine, a new life, but the past is never completely absent. One day, while organizing a new batch of books, I received a call from my lawyer. Andrew had officially initiated divorce proceedings. Although I expected this news, I couldn't help but be deeply affected. It was the definitive end of what had once been a beautiful dream. That night, I cried myself to sleep, but the next morning, I got up with a new resolution. I would accept the divorce with dignity, and do everything possible to make the process as painless as possible for Andrew. Months passed, and little by little, I began to heal. I made new friends at the bookstore and in my neighborhood, people who didn't judge me for my past, but accepted me for who I was. Now I started participating in a support group for people going through difficult divorces, and I discovered that sharing my story and listening to others helped me process my own emotions. One afternoon, as I was closing the bookstore, I received an unexpected call. It was Robert. My heart skipped a beat when I heard his voice. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice laden with emotion. "I know you probably don't want to talk to me, but I needed to know how you were doing." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to hang up, to cut that last tie to my past. But another part, the part that had been working on forgiveness and acceptance, decided to listen. I'm okay, Robert," I finally replied, trying to rebuild my life. Our conversation was brief and somewhat uncomfortable. Robert told me that the farm was going through hard times, that the town still hadn't fully forgiven him. He talked about Andrew, who had briefly returned to pick up some things and then left again, without saying where he was going. When I hung up, I felt strangely at peace. Talking to Robert had been like closing a chapter, acknowledging that that part of my life was over, but that it didn't define who I was now. The following days were of intense reflection. I thought a lot about Andrew, about the harm we had caused him. I decided to write him a letter, not to ask for forgiveness. I knew that was asking too much, but to express my sincere regret and wish him the best. Writing that letter was one of the most difficult and cathartic acts of my life. I poured into it all my regret, my shame, but also my hope that he could find the happiness he deserved. I didn't expect a response, and I didn't receive one. But the act of writing it helped me take another step towards healing. As time passed, I began to feel that I was regaining control of my life. I was no longer defined by my past mistakes, but by my present actions and my hopes for the future. I started taking night classes at the local university, studying literature. I discovered a passion for writing that I didn't know I had. I began writing stories, fiction at first, but gradually, I dared to explore my own experience in my writing. One day, almost a year after my return to the city, I was closing the bookstore when I saw a familiar figure on the sidewalk across the street. It was Andrew. Our eyes met for an instant, and I felt as if time had stopped. He didn't approach, and I didn't make any move towards him. We simply looked at each other for a moment, and then he nodded slightly before turning around and walking away. That brief encounter left me shaking, but it also gave me a strange sense of closure. Andrew hadn't forgiven me. His gaze still showed pain. But the fact that he hadn't looked away, that he had acknowledged my presence, gave me hope that someday, maybe, we could at least coexist in peace. That night, sitting in my small apartment, I reflected on the path that had brought me here. I had made terrible mistakes. I had hurt people I loved. I had lost a lot along the way. But I had also learned. I had grown. I had found a strength in me that I didn't know existed. I looked out the window, towards the city lights, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of genuine optimism. My story was far from over. I had much to learn, much to give, much to live for. I couldn't change the past, but I could shape my future. And I was determined to do it in a way that would make me proud, one decision at a time. As I prepared for bed, I thought about the words I had read in one of the bookstore's books. Forgiveness is the fragrance that the violet leaves on the heel that has crushed it. Maybe someday, I thought, I would be able to forgive myself completely, and maybe, just maybe, others could forgive me too. With that thought, I closed my eyes, ready to face another day, another opportunity to be better, to do things right. My story continued, and I was determined to write a new chapter, one filled with hope, redemption, and hopefully, a bit of happiness. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months. My life acquired a new routine, one that filled me with purpose and satisfaction. mornings at the bookstore, afternoons studying or writing, evenings reflecting on my progress and my goals. My literature studies became an increasingly deep passion. I discovered I had a natural ability to analyze texts, to unravel the hidden meanings in the words of great authors. My professors began to notice my dedication and talent, and encouraged me to consider an academic career. One day, while I was immersed in reading Madame Bovary by Flaubert, I realized how much I identified with the protagonist. Like Emma Bovary, I too had sought passion and excitement outside my marriage, with disastrous consequences. But unlike her, I had survived my fall, had found the strength to get up and move on. This realization inspired me to write an essay, comparing my experience with that of Emma Bovary. I did it with brutal honesty, not sparing the painful details of my own story. When I finished, I felt exhausted but strangely liberated. With trembling hands, I handed it to my literature professor. Part of me feared her reaction, feared being judged once again. But when she returned the essay a week later, her eyes were shining with enthusiasm. "Elizabeth," she told me, "this is extraordinary. Your analysis is profound, and your honesty it's impressive. I think you should consider publishing it." Her words left me breathless. Publish my story? Expose myself in that way to the world? The idea both terrified and excited me in equal parts. After much reflection and several conversations with my therapist, I decided to take the leap. I worked for months polishing the essay, expanding it into a short memoir. Every word I wrote was like pulling a thorn from my heart, painful but necessary. The day I received the acceptance letter from a small local publisher, I cried. They weren't tears of sadness or joy, but of relief. At last I felt I was doing something meaningful with my experience, that perhaps my story could help others avoid my mistakes or find the strength to overcome theirs. The publication of my book was a bittersweet moment. On one hand, I felt proud of what I had accomplished. On the other, it meant exposing my story to a wider audience, including the people from my past. It wasn't long before I received a call from Robert. He had read the book, "Elizabeth," he told me, his voice broken with emotion. "Thank you for your honesty. Reading your perspective, it's helped me understand many things, and it's made me realize how sorry I am too." That conversation was a turning point in our relationship. We didn't go back to being what we were before. That was impossible. But we managed to establish a kind of cautious friendship. Based on mutual understanding and shared regret, Andrew, for his part, never contacted me directly after the book's publication. But through mutual friends, I learned that he had read it. I was told he had commented that the book had helped him find some closure, although the pain and betrayal were still present. The following months were a whirlwind. My book, though not a great commercial success, received critical acclaim for its honesty and emotional depth. I was invited to give talks at universities and support groups, sharing my story and the lessons I had learned. At one of these talks, I met Martin, a psychology professor who had been through his own experience of infidelity and forgiveness. We quickly became friends, united by our shared experiences and our desire to help others. Over time, our friendship turned into something more. It was a slow and careful process. Both had emotional scars and fears to overcome, but we also had a deep understanding of the fragility of trust and the importance of honesty. Martin taught me that it was possible to love again, that my past didn't define me or condemn me to a life of loneliness, and I taught him that vulnerability isn't weakness, but a form of strength. Today, as I write these words, I look back on the path I've traveled and marvel at how far I've come. From the lost and desperate woman I once was, to the person I am now. A published writer, a doctoral student in literature, a woman capable of loving and being loved. I don't mean to say that everything is perfect. There are still days when guilt weighs on me, when I wonder what if. But those days are becoming less frequent. I've learned to forgive myself, to accept my past as a part of who I am, but not as the only thing that defines me. My relationship with Martin is different from any other I've had. It's based on absolute honesty, open communication, mutual respect. We've learned to face problems together, not to run away when things get tough. Robert and I maintain sporadic contact. Our conversations are friendly, but always tinged with a certain melancholy. We both know that what we did can't be undone, but we also know that we've grown and learned from it. Andrew remains a painful absence in my life. I know he'll probably never fully forgive me, and I understand that. But I hope that, like me, he's found a way to move forward, to find the happiness he deserves. As I look out the window of my study, I see the sunset painting the sky in warm hues. Martin is in the kitchen, preparing dinner. I can hear the soft tinkling of dishes and the aroma of food fills the apartment. I realize that, despite everything, I am happy. Not with the naive and carefree happiness of my youth, but with a deeper and more mature happiness. A happiness that comes from acceptance, from growth, from love earned with effort and honesty. My story isn't over. I know I still have many chapters to write, many challenges to face, but I no longer fear the future. I've learned that I'm stronger than I thought, more resilient than I imagined. And if there's one lesson I hope others can learn from my story, it's this. No matter how dark the path may seem, there's always hope. There's always a chance for redemption, for growth, for love. We just have to be brave enough to take it. As I close my diary and prepare to join Martin in the kitchen, I feel a deep gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons learned, for second chances, and for the strength I've found within myself. The aroma of dinner draws me to the kitchen, where Martin is finishing setting the table. He greets me with a warm smile, that smile that always manages to brighten even my darkest days. "How's the writing going?" he asks as I approach to give him a kiss on the cheek. "Good," I reply. "I think I'm close to finishing the first draft of my novel." Martin nods approvingly. He's been my biggest support in this new project, a novel that explores themes of forgiveness and redemption. Although it's not autobiographical, it certainly draws from my personal experiences. We sit down to dinner, enjoying the food and each other's company. Our conversation flows easily, jumping from trivial topics to deep discussions about life and love. It's in these moments when I most appreciate what we have, this connection we've built on the foundations of honesty and mutual understanding. After dinner, as we wash the dishes together, Martin looks at me with a serious expression. "Elizabeth," he says, "there's something I want to talk to you about." I feel a knot in my stomach. Despite how far I've come, there are still moments when the fear of losing everything I've gained paralyzes me. "What is it?" I ask, trying to keep calm. Martin takes a deep breath before continuing. "I've been thinking a lot lately, about us, about our future. My heart beats hard. Is he having doubts about our relationship? And I've realized something," he continues. "I can't imagine my life without you, Elizabeth. I want to spend the rest of my days with you, sharing our joys and facing our challenges together." He kneels in front of me, pulling a small box from his pocket. "Elizabeth, would you do me the honor of marrying me?" Tears spring from my eyes as I look at the beautiful ring in the box. It's simple but elegant, just like our relationship. "Yes," I whisper, my voice broken with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you." Martin slides the ring onto my finger and we melt into an embrace. At that moment, I feel that everything in my life has led to this point. All the mistakes, all the lessons learned, all the personal growth have prepared me for this moment of pure happiness. However, in the midst of my joy, I can't help but think of Andrew. How will he react when he finds out about my engagement? Will he feel that I'm completely leaving behind our shared past? As if reading my thoughts, Martin takes my hands and looks me in the eyes. "I know this might bring up complicated emotions," he says softly. "And I want you to know that I understand your past is part of who you are, Elizabeth, and I accept it completely. I don't expect you to forget or ignore that part of your life. I just hope you'll allow me to be part of your future. His words move me deeply. Once again, I marvel at the understanding and love that Martin offers me. In the days that follow, as we share the news of our engagement with friends and family, I find myself reflecting on the path that has led me here. I think about the naive young woman I was, the lost woman I became, and the person I am now. I decide it's time to close another chapter of my past. With Martin's support, I write a letter to Andrew. It's not an invitation to our wedding. I know that would be inappropriate and painful for him. Instead, it's a letter of gratitude and farewell. I thank him for the good times we shared, for the lessons I learned from our marriage and its loss. I ask for forgiveness once again, although I know I may never fully receive it. And finally, I sincerely wish him to find the happiness he deserves. Sending that letter is like lifting a weight off my shoulders. I don't expect a response, and I don't receive one. But the act of writing and sending it helps me close that chapter of my life in a way that allows me to look to the future with an open heart. As Martin and I stand hand in hand, looking out at the sunset from our apartment balcony, I feel a sense of peace wash over me. My journey has been long and difficult, filled with mistakes and regrets, but also with growth and redemption. I know that the road ahead won't always be easy, but I'm no longer afraid to face it. I squeeze Martin's hand, feeling the cool metal of my engagement ring against my skin. It's a symbol not just of our love, but of the second chance I've been given. A chance to live, to love, and to be the person I was always meant to be. As the last rays of sunlight fade from the sky, I smile. My story isn't over. In many ways, it feels like it's just beginning. And this time, I'm determined to write a tale of love, honesty, and redemption. A tale that, I hope, might inspire others to find the strength to overcome their own mistakes and create a future filled with hope and possibility.